Hello, Dr. Older. This is Clay Robinson. I will be giving my presentation on war-shaped futures, an observation of the recent Russian invasion of Ukraine. This is kind of pivoting from the paper proposal I'd submitted, but I think the situation unfolding in Europe is very relevant to what we've been talking about in class. So first off, just a little background. I think this is important when we're talking about futures to look at the past first. So about a decade ago, President Barack Obama said famously during a debate to then presidential candidate Mitt Romney, the 80s called, they want their foreign policy back. And several news organizations commented on this. Obama, the 80s called, they want their foreign policy back about those bayonets. Romney was ridiculed for this position at the time. People thought Obama was spot on about foreign policy. But now, if you take a look, today, 10 years later, Mitt Romney recently said the 80s called and we didn't answer. And now all these same outlets are crediting Mitt Romney for his position back then. This isn't to get inherently political, but there's obvious that the media kind of has an influence on these types of conversations and how these futures unfold. The 80s got their foreign policy back. Wall Street Journal, it's time to admit it, Mitt Romney was right about Russia. CNN, he didn't forget. So the reason why I bring this up is I want to talk about how futures are shaped by news media. This is something I hinted at in my initial proposal, and I still think it's really relevant in what's going on in Ukraine. They really set the tone of the conversation. And what I mean by that is they decide what's important, who the actors are in these conversations, and where the focus is, so where information is coming from. They have a big responsibility for verifying sources of information. Right now, something we're seeing is that a lot of things coming out of Ukraine and the invasion from Russia is that a lot of content that we're seeing is not necessarily from there. It's actually false information from past invasions, from past videos. I even saw one that they used rockets being fired into Israel a few months ago as being fired into Kyiv, the capital of Russia, but that's been verified false. And I think this has to do a lot with the fact that the news media relies on American ignorance of foreign policy. It's reported that 95% of Americans have little or no interest in foreign policy. And so we really rely on the news media to give us an accurate picture of what's going on. In a sense, they shape what's happening now and what's going to happen in the future and our understanding of what's going to happen. Next, social media. These are just some of the things that's come out in the past 2 days. Putin orders invasion of Eastern Ukraine, Twitter, video of President Zelensky, let those who remember gave their lives be remembered forever, Wall Street Journal and Instagram, photos of Kyiv, even TikTok now, video of Ukrainian woman evacuating out of the city. And so social media has really a big influence on how futures are shaped and our understanding of this conflict. Some of the ways that it does this is that we have instant access to information. Obviously, this is not something we had in a previous conflict. Consumers can be overwhelmed by digital media. This is something right now that's happening. We're getting so much information that we don't know what to do with it, and we don't know if it's true. Misinformation is the rule, not the exception. Like I said, there's so much misinformation coming out. So social media, we don't really have the chance to, when we see something, is that true? And it really shapes our idea of what's going on. And in a sense, social media influences public opinion and therefore shapes policy decisions. And this is incredibly impactful of futures. So next, timeline of the conflict, just real briefly. In November, intelligence agencies said satellite imagery, troops were being built on the Ukrainian border along with takes on the military hardware. Russia issues security demands December 17th. NATO ceases all military activity and should never accept Ukraine into the alliance. January 24, 2022, NATO puts forces on standby. Evacuations of embassy staff begin. US deploys 8,500 soldiers. So things starting to escalate. and really kind of pushing action on a global scale. On February 17th, 2022, President Biden, Secretary of State Blinken warned Russia is on the brink of invading Ukraine. They're not sure, but we're getting close. This is last week, actually. Because there's false flag operations, Russia was not withdrawing troops. And finally, on February 24th, Russia invades Ukraine. Putin warns other nations not to intervene, appears to threaten nuclear warfare. And now, that's a future we haven't seen before, at least not from Russia after World War II. So how futures are being shaped by intelligence agencies. Real versus expected outcomes. What are we being told and what's actually happening? It really shapes the future. Intelligence could be misinterpreted, leading to undesired consequences. So false reports can lead to futures that we didn't expect. Provides critical insight to national security. So on the other hand, it is giving us information about what's going on and how these national security concerns are being addressed. And in fact, something that came out recently is analysis of the footage of Putin's invasion announcement reveals it was pre-recorded. So we knew 3 days before that this was actually happening. And so that really shapes how we're going to respond and what the future is going to look like. And finally, just to look at Russian stocks today. A huge dip. This is kind of an economic consequence of their invasion. They already have a crumbling economy, so I can't imagine how bad this is hurting them. Oil prices skyrocketing, not just Russian oil, but across the board. It's expected to see $5 to $7 gas, if not more, especially if this conflict persists. So how futures are shaped by foreign policy and kind of diplomatic action. The effect of economic sanctions and diplomatic consequences. So obviously foreign leaders are responding. Foreign leaders are responding with severe economic consequences for Russia. So how is that going to shape our economic future and kind of the way that war influences that? The impact of treaties and navigating complex treaties and international organizations like NATO and the UN. And so it's this understanding of what's going on in this region kind of shapes what's going on in the future. And so I think this really is pertinent to our conversation, I think, in Module 4 on preparing for the unknown. Obviously, we can plan all we want for these sort of conflicts, but we don't know how we're actually going to respond until it happens. And so I'm reminded of fantasy plans and the piece that we read, Fantasy Objects, the perception of safety of emergency shelter in place kits. Specifically this quote: fantasy documents make people believe in the fantastic through offering the illusion of both safety and competency. And so I was struck by this in my discussion post, and I'm still struck by this as I'm thinking about this conflict occurring in Eastern Europe and how on paper, Ukraine may have been prepared. On paper, NATO was poised to support our allies. On paper, the United States was prepared to use severe economic sanctions. However, we have been slow to react on all fronts. The only people who have maintained their courage in the face of this conflict is the Ukrainian people, at least from my perception. And so I think our global leaders need to act swiftly before this gets out of hand. I mean, this needs to be taken seriously. This is not just another skirmish. This could have dire consequences if it gets crazy. And so I think one of the huge things we need to be on the lookout for is exploring the future of China, or various futures of China. China refused to call the Russian attack on Ukraine an invasion and deflects the blame to the US. Not surprising, expected, but what wasn't expected is that reports of 9 Chinese aircraft in Taiwan's airspace defense zone, signaling an escalation of Chinese aggression against Taiwan. And I would not be surprised if China acts while the world is distracted by Ukraine to retake Taiwan, and that would just escalate a global conflict and propel us into a future that is probably not something we wanted or desired. And so I hope this kind of gives you an understanding of what my paper is about and how the impact of war has consequences on so many aspects of the future, and how really they're related in so many different ways. And I just kind of worked on this today, and I think it's just really relevant to what we were talked about in class these last few weeks. And so I just want to thank you for a good class. And yeah, that's it.